Today we're going to look at how Barnabas modeled discipleship with Saul, who eventually became Paul. And so there you can see I've got several passages out of the book of Acts, and I've got them on the next three screens. So read through this one, and then when you're ready, then you can pause it until you're done, or of course you can read it out of your own Bible, or maybe you got your own translation. But you can see here's the beginning of it, and then here's the middle of those passages, and then when you're ready, and you can pause that until you're done reading it, and then you can look here at the end. And so those are the passages about Barnabas and Saul. And then the question, I only have two, and the first one is to just trace the relationship of Barnabas and Paul, or actually he starts out Saul, and at each stage, what's their status and who takes the lead and how does the relationship work? And then kind of the application question is, are you eager to launch your disciples, or are you afraid for them to leave the nest? And so think about those questions. Look at the relationship of Barnabas and Saul. If you get a chance, discuss it with others and pray about it. And then when you're ready, come back and I'll talk with you about it. Okay, here we are. Welcome back. Well, almost from the start, you can see Barnabas is a recognized leader in the church, but Saul is the one who persecutes it. Well, then, of course, you know from chapter 9 what happens, how Jesus calls Saul and makes him an apostle. And when the believers do not trust Saul, Barnabas is the one who vouches for him. And that he's the one who says, you can trust him. Barnabas is a trusted leader, and because he trusts Saul, the other believers say, okay, we'll trust him too. And then after Saul has been farmed out to Tarsus, well, and this is what happens. I read one commentator said that the leaders in the church of Jerusalem must have breathed a collective sigh of relief as they saw Saul departing for Tarsus after all the trouble that was occasioned. Now, that may or may not be true. Saul was obviously recognized as a leader and that Jesus was with him, but the believers realized that his life was in danger and that he was an occasion for trouble between the anti-Jesus Jews and the pro-Jesus Jews. So off they send him to Tarsus. Well, Barnabas recognizes an area where Saul's gifts are needed and brings him into it. He goes and gets him. And then, of course, when the church needs somebody trustworthy to deliver the money, they pick Barnabas and his disciple Saul. Now, in the ancient world, obviously you would travel with more than one person. The only way to convey money is physically to do it. And if one person travels, as much, robbers or on the way, highwaymen can attack them, kill them, steal the money. Makes it harder to do when there's two or more people. Also, it's a way of developing trust, that you show that you're a person of integrity, that you have two people involved. And so it's a little bit overreading to say everywhere Barnabas went, Saul went with him. But it may be that Barnabas recognized that part of discipleship is accompanying someone, and that it was an important part for Saul to go with him. And so we see them going off together to deliver the money to the church in Jerusalem. And then they come back to Antioch, and Barnabas is obviously a leader in the church at Antioch. He's listed first among the prophets and teachers. Saul, his disciple, where's he listed? Absolutely last. And maybe in the list only because of his relationship to Barnabas. Now, Saul obviously is called to be an apostle and to have that authority the way the 12 did. But at least at this case, in this time, he seems to be not exercising that. It seems not to be recognized by other people. Barnabas is certainly the leader at this point. Well, and what happens? The prophetic word says, "Separate unto me Barnabas and Saul for the work I have for them." And this is the beginning of cross-cultural ministry. Now, we talked about this before when we talked about prophecy, but here's a wonderful example. Remember, in the New Testament, when a prophet gives a word, the church adjudicates, the church deliberates, the church decides, is this really from God? In the Old Testament, if you were convinced the prophet was from God, you just obeyed. But in the New Testament, you have to, since everybody has the Spirit, everybody who has the Spirit is involved in the process of deciding, is this really a word from God or not? And so it says, after the church had fasted and prayed, then they decided, yes, this is a word from God, and then they obeyed. It's not slowness or a lack of obedience or an unwillingness to obey. They are just doing what they knew was the right thing to do. Now, Paul tells us about this later in his writings, but they're acting it out way before Paul even writes about it. So when Paul writes about what to do, he's just telling what the church did. So the prophetic word comes, but they have to decide, is this really from God or not? And they decide that it is, so off they send Barnabas and Saul, and off they go to Cyprus. Now at Cyprus, Sergius Paulus is the governor there, and he wants to be, or he's starting to listen, but what Barnabas and Saul say is opposed by kind of a court magician or like an advisor named Elymas or Bar Jesus. And Saul is the one whom God uses in a power encounter. Saul strikes him blind. Now that's not because Saul hated him or he was being mean or trying to punish him or anything like that, but it's a power encounter to show that Jesus really is God, that his name is powerful, that he represents, that he is the true God of the universe, and he's more powerful than whatever spirits Elymas was serving. And as we said before, oftentimes when the gospel goes into a new area, there are these power encounters where the power of God is shown as opposed to the false gods. And Saul is the one who takes the lead to do that. Now, then after that happens, then they go off to Pamphylia. They go back to the mainland. And by the time the team reaches Pamphylia, Paul is so clearly the leader that Barnabas isn't even mentioned. What does it say? Paul and his companions. Now, how did that make Barnabas feel? We don't know. How did it make John Mark feel? Well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe it's Paul becoming clearly the leader of the group, and maybe that makes John Mark feel bad that his uncle has been displaced in the leadership, and maybe that's why he leaves. We don't know. There may be other factors, but that's a possibility. But it's not a problem for Barnabas because they keep going together. Paul, after the journey, God uses them, successful journey, come back to Antioch, and a little bit later, Paul takes the lead in suggesting a follow-up missionary journey. He's taking the initiative, and he goes to Barnabas and says, let's do it again. And Barnabas says, great idea, I want to take Mark. But Paul disagrees. Now, there's nothing in the scripture that says this isn't a good idea or that God didn't want this. It's an amazing thing. I mean, Paul is an apostle. I mean, he's got the authority of Jesus. And yet, apparently, he doesn't say, Jesus says, or Barnabas doesn't say, I'm the older one. God apparently did not prohibit this from happening, did not say, Barnabas, you need to listen to Saul, or Saul, you need to listen to Barnabas. God apparently did not tell them what to do in this situation, and they disagreed. Now, the net result was that we have two teams instead of one. But Paul, we can see Paul has learned enough from Barnabas that he takes Silas as his disciple. He doesn't go anywhere alone. He's learned that. And then, of course, Barnabas takes Mark. So now we have 2 missionary teams. Meanwhile, Barnabas, always ready to encourage the outcast. Remember, Barnabas was called the son of encouragement, Barney the encourager. Always ready to encourage the outcast, gives Mark another chance. So they go. Now, Acts tells us about Paul and Silas, does not tell us what God did through Mark and Barnabas, but we can imagine that was a very successful trip. And then we see from 2 Timothy 4:11, we see Paul and Mark eventually restored their relationship. Mark is useful to Paul, Paul says. So that's good. The relationship is restored. Now, these passages are a model of selfless giving in discipleship. The goal of discipleship is not eternal dependence. It's not you're always up here and he's down here or she's down here, but it's to empower the disciple to live out the full potential of his or her God-given gifts. I've seen this in ministries, sadly. I've seen sometimes a pastor is working with a discipler, working with a disciple, but when that disciple starts growing and it becomes mature and starts wanting to make decisions for him or herself, oftentimes there can be problems from the discipler, and the discipler can see issues and the relationships is strained, and it causes a fracture, a break in the relationship. On the other hand, when I was at Park Street, I saw a wonderful example of passing the torch. Let me tell you, we had a pastor there named Bob, and Bob was involved in the college ministry, and Bob eventually had responsibility for the graduate ministry and for the college ministry, both at the same time. And Bob, though, before he was a minister, before he was a pastor, was involved in the college ministry. And it turns out he was a senior one year, and he met a freshman who at his school, a freshman named Carl. Carl had come from a kind of a Christian background, but was not a red-hot, super committed Christian. But he knew he ought to go to church, and so he started coming to our church. And Bob at the time was a senior at the same college, and Bob got to know Carl and started discipling him. They'd eat lunch together fairly regularly, and it turned out that Bob had a car, and the easiest way to get to church was to go by car. So Bob would oftentimes on Sundays go to pick Carl up and take him to church. And it was about a 15-minute ride to church or so. Well, we were having a fall retreat, like I told you about earlier when I told you about the program for the whole year. And one of the main points of the retreat was you should be committed to the group. And so we had a meeting that ended at about 10 o'clock at night. So it's 10 o'clock at night, and Bob and Carl are driving home in the car, and Bob says to Carl, are you planning on going to the retreat? And Carl says, well, I don't know. I got a lot of homework. It costs money. It's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It's all this time. I'm not really sure that I ought to go, and I'm not really committed to go on this retreat. And Bob says to him, Carl, do you know where you are? And Carl says, well, I'm in your car, but where I am in Boston and where I am in relationship to my college, I don't know. And Bob says, Carl, unless you sign up for the retreat, I'm going to stop the car and you're going to get out and walk, find your own way home. And Carl thought about it. He said, maybe I should go to the retreat. Later, you could say that somebody could say to Carl, why'd you decide to go on the retreat? You know what? And Carl could say, well, Bob most clearly explained to me the benefits of that retreat. Now, was Bob really going to stop the car and throw Carl out? I doubt it. But it made the point that it was a really important thing, and maybe Carl wasn't really sure what Bob would do. Well, it turned out Bob and Carl became really good friends, and all during Carl's 4 years of college, from his freshman year on, Bob worked with him and discipled him. They led groups together. They helped run the ministry together. They met regularly every week. They became dear friends. And then Carl felt called to the pastorate. And so then he went to the same seminary that Bob had graduated from. And then when stayed part of the ministry that Bob was part of too. Well, when Carl was ready to graduate, Bob, who had been responsible for both the graduate ministry and the college ministry, invited and worked with the church to get the church to hire Bob to run the graduate ministry. Carl to run the graduate ministry. Bob thought that he personally was doing better with the college students, and even though Carl was about the same age as the other graduate students, he figured he had a really good relationship with them. He was esteemed by them, and his gifts were fine for that group. And so Bob persuaded the church to hire Carl and bring him on at the same level that Bob was, to be a co-pastor and to run that graduate group. And Carl ran the graduate group and did a great job. To me, watching that from outside, that was just such a wonderful opportunity of passing on discipleship, and having raising someone up to the exact same level that you are, and giving him the freedom to use his gifts, and not being jealous, but just rejoicing in what God had done in the other person's life. So that to me was like a Barnabas situation. Seems to me that Bob was doing what Barnabas had done with Paul. Now, to finish up, my grand discipler, Chuck Miller, defined 4 stages of leadership. First, you do it, or I do it. First, I do it. Then I do it, and you watch me. You're with me. Then the next stage is that I pass on the responsibility to you. You do it, and I watch. And then the 4th stage is you do it alone. Now, these stages can be a useful needs filter for imparting a skill or defining a role. We need to determine where our disciple is in the learning process. I'm doing it, and she watches. Then we pass the responsibility to her, she does it, and I watch, and then finally she can do it by herself. The goal is always training someone to replace us in every role, training our successors, or training the people who can do it with us. And as God expands the ministry, there are always more and more people needed. And so this is a wonderful example from Barnabas about how to do that. So, of course, my question to you this week is, or this session is, what is the most important truth God has revealed to you today? And how will you obey it this week? What steps will you take right away to put this into practice? Now, this may be one that you won't be able to put into practice maybe for some years, but at least you can be thinking about it and praying about it. And how can I eventually be a Barnabas and pass on leadership?